Hey, well, welcome and thanks for joining our webinar today. We have a really valuable discussion planned about threat testing your environment against cyber attacks and identifying where your company is vulnerable to bad actors. I'm Trista Perot, Marketing Director for Global Data Vault, a Dataprise company, getting us started with a few housekeeping items before I introduce our speakers. The webinar is going to run close to an hour, but we'll be sure to leave time for questions at the end, and we definitely want your questions. While everyone's set to listen-only mode, we absolutely want to hear from you. So we'll be monitoring chat and capture any of those questions that you have and make sure the speakers address them either in the moment or we'll circle back at the end. So the webinar is being recorded in case you love it so much and want to watch it again or have to leave early. You'll get that link after the session. It will also be available on our websites, or you can watch it via our YouTube channels anytime. Before I start, let me set the stage for who we are. You probably caught me saying websites and channels, plural. That's because Global Data Vault was recently acquired and is now part of the Dataprise family. So Dataprise is a strategic managed service provider offering innovative IT solutions and services that enable our clients to excel at their core business. Our service suite includes managed cybersecurity, managed infrastructure, managed user, 24/7 help desk, and much more. We want to add extreme value to our clients by becoming their end-to-end technology partner. One of the ways we excel at that is through our BCDR division, which some of the folks in our audience may know as purely as Global Data Vault. And while we're part of a much bigger Dataprise family now, we continue our commitment to being the premier Veeam Platinum Cloud Service provider, offering fully managed disaster recovery as a service, backup as a service, and Microsoft 365 backup solutions. We pride ourselves at being specialists when it comes to Veeam, and we demonstrate that through our deep expertise and talented staff, which includes Veeam architects and a Veeam Vanguard. And with that, let me start introducing our speakers. Since I mentioned the Veeam Vanguard, I'll go ahead and start there. So today we have Stephen New, Operations Director for Global Data Vault, and he's our Veeam Vanguard and always has sage advice for protecting your backups. Kelly Culwell is serving as moderator, and he's our Senior Service Transition Manager for Dataprise, and he's leading our discussion today with our very special guest, Stephen Jones, Vice President for Cybersecurity Services at Dataprise. And as we have two awesome Stevens today, we're going to go ahead and call Stephen Jones throughout the webinar. So Jones, I'm going to kick it over to you to get us started and lead it off with a question. What's the reality of a cyber attack to the average business? There are lots of stats out there. Here, I'm going to throw some up on the screen, but I think everyone really wants to hear from somebody who's actually in the trenches. Can you share with us what you're seeing?
Yeah. Thanks, Trista. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. The reality is that over the last several years, the frequency of cyber attacks has been increasing. The estimate that you see here is 1 every 39 seconds, with an estimated 30,000 websites a day getting hacked. I think there's also a metric around 700,000 Facebook accounts are compromised each day as well. And the vast majority of these things are the result of human error, either through misconfiguration, not following policies, procedures, best practices, or in some cases, just being duped or tricked by a threat actor. So the reality is that I think that trend is going to increase. We will see more cyber attacks happening more frequently, especially as the world moves further and further into being digital and connected in almost every way. Some of the other realities are that backups are now one of the first things targeted in an attack. You'll see here 94% of attacks target the backups that a company has. And this is really key to understand because this is often seen as the get out of jail free card for a company, is that, hey, we're backing things up, we're good to go. But misconfiguring those or not following a solid industry best practice backup strategy or having an immutable cloud backup policy, these things can really undermine all of your efforts if the threat actors are able to get to those backups and compromise them, because you lose your get out of jail free card. And then the other thing we're starting to see is really the concentration of attacks on certain industries. Small businesses are certainly a growing sector where we're seeing cyber threats, an increase in cyber attacks, and it's largely because small businesses tend not to have the money and resources to provide all of the enterprise grade protections, security services that they need. Healthcare, this is another big one. We see lots of stories on a monthly basis about hospitals being compromised. And this is really due to the fact that it causes such a visceral reaction, and it interrupts a very critical service, which is really what the threat actor wants, right? The more critical the thing they can interrupt, the higher the likelihood that they get paid or they get some benefit out of that disruption. Government agencies are always going to be a big target because they're usually lagging behind the commercial world. Financial institutions, for obvious reason, this is the number one motive in a cyber attack. It's almost always money. And energy and utility companies, right? So disrupting power grids and things like that are ways to really get people's attention quickly and to even, really exert a lot of influence over another nation or municipality. So I think these are things that we're going to see continue, and these industries are going to continue being impacted at higher and higher rates as well.
Jones, one of the things that we hear described a lot is a cybersecurity perimeter, thinking of a fence or whatnot. How would you describe the cybersecurity perimeter in today's remote world or more remote world, if you will? How does it work, and how do each of those impact our business?
Yeah, no, it's another great question, Kelly. So this slide actually normally builds out, so I'll kind of work through a static image here. Traditionally, the enterprise boundary was in the corporate office. There's corporate firewalls, and everybody and everything, for the most part, sat behind them. Well, that's changed quite drastically now. The perimeter has literally moved to everybody's houses, right? You'll see, based on the backgrounds, Kelly and I are in our homes, which means the perimeter has extended out to our personal domiciles now. So that means the concept of the enterprise firewall being the thing that's protecting the crown jewels is no longer true, because we have endpoints that are located outside of that now. So really, the endpoint has become the new perimeter for a modern business, especially post-pandemic, where everybody is now working remotely, or large portions of the staff are working remotely. So now we have to really be concerned with the asset and the identity being the user that is using that asset. And we also have the concept of cloud, right? So we're pushing more and more compute and workload into cloud services through SaaS and PaaS providers like AWS and Azure. And so those also represent a portion of the perimeter now as well. I think one of the big misunderstandings, and I get this more times than I care to admit, is a lot of companies feel that by moving to the cloud, that security is just kind of inherent, intrinsic, and automatic. And that could not be further from the truth. SaaS and PaaS providers are really providing you that software as a service, or that platform as a service, and they are not always focused around or security centric. That's really up to you to ensure that you're managing that portion of your perimeter properly. So that's to say that, again, we've gone from one central or maybe a couple of central enterprise-grade firewalls that were defining the perimeter to now having your perimeter literally be all over the world, being very disparate in the cloud, in people's homes, as well as your legacy offices and data centers. So this problem has really complicated the concept of perimeter quite severely.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned, SaaS and PaaS and even infrastructure as a service, because we have data in a lot of different clouds or environments. So software as a service, your things like Salesforce and some of those applications that you just log into via web portal and you don't have anything on premises to run those. Platform as a service, you might be running, development architectures or something to support applications. And infrastructure as a service, you don't want any of your own hardware, your own environment, networking, all of that's in the cloud, which is the AWSs and the Azures, can provide all of these to some degree. And especially when it comes to backups and disaster recovery, the misconception is just it's in the cloud. I don't have to worry about it. It's already protected, just like it is for cybersecurity. And they've even produced shared responsibility models to where they say exactly what they will and will not protect and what's the responsibility of the customer. And it's just so often the people don't pay attention to those. And again, they get that misconception that it's in the cloud, it's protected. So, Stephen, thinking about this, when we think about DRaaS, how do we apply that to public cloud, or, how do we run our backup and spin up and et cetera?
Well, from the backup perspective, we always want to get in the mindset that it's your data. You need to make sure that it's protected. Don't rely on anybody else, or don't assume that your data is protected. So you always want to make sure that you have not only a good backup copy in whatever cloud solution you're using, but you also want to make sure that that's located offsite as well. That way, if something were to happen in the cloud environment, then you can bring it up in the Global Data Vault infrastructure, and we can provide you access to your servers. Now, the product that we use, Veeam, has the capability of injecting that data back into Azure, back into AWS, using a proxy that's built into the software. So it's not as hard as people think.
Yeah, and the key here is just to treat the data like data, right? Make sure that you're controlling it, that you're protecting it, no matter where it resides. That's ultimately your responsibility. We just happen to provide pretty cool tools to protect it from both a cybersecurity and a disaster recovery perspective, and we can do that with an all-in-one solution with what we're discussing here. So Jones and so Stevens, the next slide is about vulnerabilities and sort of identifying where you're vulnerable. So if you guys want to start talking through this, just based on experience, these are all kind of interconnected and they all play a little bit of a different part. So Jones, you just want to start at the top and work your way down?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing you'll see here is employees. Employees in a business represent an extreme amount of vulnerability for a variety of reasons. So you have a couple of different avenues here. One being kind of malicious intent. It really is intent. Malicious intent, we classify that as what we call an insider threat. And this opens a large vulnerability into your organization because you have somebody that is historically trusted with all of the things. They have permissions, they have access to stuff. And if they were disgruntled or, so desired to hurt the business, that is a large vulnerability because you have somebody that has a large amount of access and ability. From the employee perspective, you also have the accidents, the lack of following a policy or a procedure. You have just taking shortcuts or being sloppy, right? Those things also present a vulnerability. And for some of the same reason, because they do have access, they do have credentials. And even if they're not intending to do something to harm the business, they still pose a threat to the business. Next, we have smart devices. So think IoT. These are, I think, a little bit more common in larger enterprises, and they are typically around things like HVAC, elevators, maybe lighting if you're in a very modern building. But smart devices also pose a risk if they're not segmented properly, managed properly, because they are small computers, and we tend not to think of them as such. It's a thermostat, it might be a lighting controller or something like that. It's actually a computer. It has a processor in it, it has code, it has storage. We're seeing more and more of these things being used as a mechanism for infiltrating a network. And again, not segmented properly, these things can be really disastrous. Remote workstations, as I mentioned before, post-pandemic and even during the pandemic, everybody went home to work, which meant that you had a corporate laptop in an unclean network behind an unknown ISP. So that posed a huge risk to every organization, especially ones that did not have robust or mature remote work posture capabilities, because they had to figure out how to allow the entire company to remotely access and work, which meant playing catch up on the security side. Endpoints, more or less the same thing. Endpoints can include everything from workstations, laptops, to mobile devices, cell phones, tablets, all of those things. If you think about, pretty much all business that gets done on the network is done with an endpoint by an identity or user. So that endpoint is the portal into your network. You have 1,000 users, you have 1,000 portals into your network, right? And you have a user that you're relying on providing good hygiene, good practice, following policy, following procedure, combined with this endpoint that needs to be patched and maintained and all of those fun things. So that you can start to see where the vulnerabilities start to stack up and multiply here. And then, of course, we have network and our vendors. I'll leave backups for Steve New to cover down on. But the network is now extending into people's homes. It's in coffee shops. It's in our pockets, right, with our smartphones. And then we have third-party risk from vendors. So we have products that we install that are managed by vendors in central locations. Think about RMM tools. And there was a big kind of famous case last year where an RMM provider was compromised and customers who were using that provider's product were ultimately impacted and affected through no fault of their own, but it was a risk introduced by a third party. So these are all things that, to Kelly, your point, they're all interconnected. They're absolutely all related, and they end up compounding the level of vulnerability and risk to the organization if each one of them is not handled and addressed properly. And Steve, do you want to cover the backup section there?
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned, Joan, at the beginning of the call that the backups is your get out of jail free card. That is the first thing that is normally targeted during a cyber attack because they don't want you to get out of jail free. They want you to pay the ransom. So what they're going to do is they're going to, first of all, go in and either encrypt your backups with the same encryption method they do for all your data, or they're going to delete the backups if they're already encrypted. So what we normally see during a cyber attack is the first thing that is attacked is the backups, and they're deleted. So what we do with our customers is Dataprise provides something called enhanced data protection, or EDP data. What this EDP data is it's data that lives outside of your repository that we can bring up if you are infected so that you have something. Also, what we do is whenever we bring you up, we disable the internet because most people don't know that what these threats do is they reach out via internet to a proxy server or some sort of server, and that's how it actually gets encrypted. It checks in. So we turn off the internet. More than likely is when we restore your servers, we're going to need to make sure that those servers are not infected, that the threat does not live on those servers. And that's very important. First thing we do, disable your tenant when you come in, and then we go ahead and start spinning up your environment from your EDP, enhanced data protection backups, which is essentially our ransomware protection for your organization.
Yeah. And now that we've talked about where we're vulnerable, and the answer is pretty much anywhere, the common denominator is really the person, right? It's the weakest link because we can set methods, we can set policies and controls in place to control the software and the hardware. We're the fleshy parts that are gullible or susceptible. We have feelings and emotions, and we click on things because we don't want our Amazon accounts to be suspended and things like that, right? So it's really us. So when we identify these areas of risk, the suspected risk is always the people, but there are some gotchas within that still kind of play back to those other areas. So we have a couple of case studies here. Obviously, we're going to protect the identities of those affected, but one of them was a repeating reinfection. And one of them was an executive assistant who was part of a spear phishing attack on the executive. So who wants to handle the repeating infection one?
I'll handle that. So the repeating infection, this is going to basically lead off on my previous comment of you need to make sure that your backups are not infected. Because once you restore that, if you do not scan your backups, you can get infected over and over again if the threat still lives on your servers. An example is we had a company where a security guard was using a kiosk in the lobby overnight, surfing the internet that did not have protection on it, and clicked on something. I'm only assuming they clicked on something to get a threat downloaded to the kiosk, and nobody knew that was happening. The company got hit by ransomware. We brought them up. We got them working again. We scheduled a fallback. And then after we scheduled the fallback, they got hit again. Everything was encrypted within 48 hours. So after working with this customer, we finally deep dived into the situation to determine what system in the infrastructure kept encrypting the data. And then the company security team got involved and determined that a overnight security guard was actually using the kiosk in the lobby to surf the internet and downloaded something malicious to that kiosk that was basically that nobody knew had internet access. They didn't put virus protection on it because it wasn't supposed to have internet access. So that's just an example of, first of all, you need to make sure everything in your organization is protected, even if it's PC behind a conference room, TV, a kiosk in a lobby. I mean, everything needs to be protected. And then after you recover from the DR event, you need to make sure that all threats are cleared from your systems so that you don't get reinfected. Because unfortunately, the people that create these ransomware malwares, they're in the business of getting money from you. They're not going to provide you the decryption key until you pay them or until you get a good backup that was not infected. So that was just the situation that happened in repeating reinfection.
Yeah, it's really important to maintain not only accurate documentation of your environment, but something to tell you if there is a device out there that isn't protected. And I think more modern tools today can do that. I mean, I always talk about the days when SQL Slammer was around and I had to crawl around under desks in a 1 million square foot building looking for rogue SQL servers and things like that. And it was awful. And oftentimes, it's not what you can't see, but what you can see. Jones, this assistance one, it was something that was sort of right there in front of your face and it still kind of happened, right? So walk us through that if you would.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So this is another real world scenario. Again, names changed to protect the innocent, but we had a client that was spearphished. It was the CEO who was spearphished through his executive assistant. So they phished, the threat actor phished the executive assistant. And like most executive assistants, she had send on behalf of and read writes to the CEO's mailbox, right? The CEO was the ultimate target. And the kind of nefarious piece of this attack was that the attacker actually compromised the executive assistant a week before they launched their master plan. And they took that week very smartly to watch. That's all they did was sit there and watch email communications in and out from the CEO. And the whole goal that they were after was to commit wire fraud. So they crafted an email and they had watched for a week how the CEO communicated. They were able to grab actual snippets, copy and paste, snippets of conversations. So they avoided the bad grammar. They avoided misspelling words because they really just repurposed the CEO's existing communications. And they crafted an email and they sent it from the actual CEO. This was the other kind of nefarious piece of the attack is they were already inside. They had already compromised an account. And they were able to send on behalf of the CEO, and they crafted this email to the CFO asking that individual to wire $250,000 to an account. And this was actually not unusual. The CEO did ask for this to be done on other occasions. And the only thing that ended up actually preventing this attack from being successful was the fact that the CFO had a process in place to call and validate or verify that the request was legitimate. And so when he called the CEO and said, hey, I got this request, you want me to wire $250,000 to this account? The CEO said, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? And that ended up squashing it. So this is really highlighting the importance of people and process because we see this all the time go wrong where they don't have this one little process, right? Pick up the phone and call to ask if this is legitimate or normal. And we see money, hundreds of thousands of dollars disappear. And if it makes it overseas, often the US government can't interdict and that money can just be gone. So this is a growing trend, especially in the real estate sector. But this was, really a real masterclass in patience and, really attacking weaknesses in people. And again, it was really just this one small process that this company had put in place that prevented them from losing $250,000.
Yeah, and it's often the process, and that's also more of a business process. Just, hey, don't willy-nilly transfer money around, in addition to being prevention of a cybersecurity incident or other. So having that readiness in many areas is really important. So today, we're going to talk more about cyber readiness. And we've talked about BCDR planning, things like that in other webinars. Stephen can hit on those again. But when we think about cyber readiness, you've already gone through the perimeter. We know a little bit by being in the industry that we are. There's things like firewalls and antivirus and things like that, right? So when we talk about cyber readiness to clients, how do we generally go through that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of key areas that I think are really important that I cover with clients who are really interested in upping their security posture or having a real conversation around cyber readiness. I always start with strategic planning. Without a plan, you don't know where you're going. So this is always the first stop. You're really understanding where a client or a prospect is trying to end up. What does it take to get there? You see here, no silos. A strategic plan for cyber readiness really needs to involve all of your business units in some capacity or another. So you can't silo this just into the security department. This really needs to be strategically thought out and planned across the entire organization. And then from there, we roll into security best practices. So there are best practices that have been identified for almost everything you can think of out there. Really starting with those as a foundation is in itself a best practice, right? So not to say that every business can follow every best practice exactly. And there may be many business reasons why a specific best practice doesn't work or cannot work. But if you're at least starting from that and understanding what the best practice is, if you have to deviate from that to do some lesser set of practices or steps, then at least you understand what the overarching goal was and can then mitigate any risk that's introduced by not following the best practice. Shortly after that is continuous employee education. I can't stress this enough, and we've talked about this on a couple of occasions already in this webinar, but humans are the weakest link. They are 95% of the cause of security incidents, and it's largely because what the three of us do for a living, cybersecurity and high-tech work, changes rapidly. And for employees for whom this is not their job, they stand an even lesser chance of keeping up with all of the new trends in phishing emails and how threat actors are going after and compromising MFA, right? We've just spent multiple years trying to convince everybody to enable MFA and that MFA is going to help your posture. And now the bad guys are right there saying, okay, they've got everybody in MFA, but if we do, this type of attack, we can get around that form of MFA, and here's how we can trick them on this form of MFA. So we need to keep a continuous employee education program running because things change rapidly. And the employees who are interacting with your systems and who are the ones ultimately being targeted to give threat actors access into your environment, they need to be aware of what the real world challenges are out there. I don't think it's enough anymore to just preach at your customers or your employees, rather, that there is the concept of phishing emails. Phishing emails are really, really sophisticated now. And, we run simulated phishing campaigns on all of our clients, or the ones that, have subscribed to that service with us. And we get directors of security, we get CISOs. We can send some pretty smart phishing emails and get even the folks who are trained to look out for this stuff. So what does, Megan in accounting stand if, this is not her world, right? So continuous employee education. Without this, I could almost argue this is probably more important than the others, but something that you absolutely need to be focused on and something that cannot just be a once annual thing. Everybody's using information systems. Everybody's dealing with data. This really needs to be something that your business prioritizes. Next is penetration testing. Through most of my career, I feel like customers have viewed this as a luxury or a nice to have. I argue that this is table stakes anymore, right? Kicking the tires on your security program in a safe and controlled manner before the Chinese and the Russians are kicking the tires on your security program is really smart. It's worth its weight in gold. and can be the difference between finding something with an opportunity to fix it versus finding something after an adversary has already founded it and exploited it. It's too late then. And so I think this is really important. If you have not had a penetration test in the last year, I would argue that this really needs to be done annually, right? I mean, if we were in person, I'd ask you to raise your hand, right? Who here drives a car and has to get it inspected every year to get that sticker changed, right? Yeah, all of us. Yep. So, why would your network be absolutely any different? Why would you not have a set of professionals evaluate your network and give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down or help you point out where the problems are?
I think, Jones, real quick, is that a lot of times we forget to go back and check things because you do something at one point and something in the environment change, or
Sure.
you may modify a firewall rule for something and it never gets removed and it's forgotten about. So sure, you have a penetration test, it passes, then you make a change in the environment. 6 months from now, you still have a rule out there that's going to allow somebody into your network. And you can resolve a lot of that just by going back and reviewing things on a regular basis.
Yeah, no, that is an absolutely fair point, Kelly. And I would even underpin that once more with, I have yet to work with a customer that could 100% tell me every device that they had and where it was. And that right there alone is why penetration testing is important. To your point, your network changes throughout the year. Lots of people are making lots of different changes. And so it's really important to understand what you look like to the outside world, where your vulnerabilities exist. And I'll cover one more with the incident response plan. And then, Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you for BCDR and DRAS. But your incident response plan is also critical, right? This is the high-level guidebook that is going to guide your business when you have a crisis, when you have a crisis of a security incident. I like to use this analogy, and if you may have seen this on LinkedIn, I did a small clip with this. I liken this to, again, firefighters. Incident response is really firefighting, right? Would you want your local fire department to show up to your house that is raging and on fire, get off the truck, and everybody's trying to figure out how to unsnap the ladder from the truck and which way you unroll the hose, and is it clockwise or counterclockwise to get it on the hydrant? You don't want that, right? You would be mortified if that was happening in your front yard while your house was burning. But most companies treat incident response this way, is they do not have a plan. It's not kept updated. It's not tested. So you're having a major crisis, a major incident, and you're sitting in a conference room and everybody's arguing over who's supposed to be doing what, or who has the ball, or who's supposed to be doing this or that or the other thing. This is firefighters trying to figure out how to get stuff off the truck. In an incident, time is money. And the longer you wait to address these things, the more damage is being done to your environment, to your data. To Steve's point earlier, they're able to find your backups. They're able to find vulnerabilities to get at your backups. If you're not able to move quickly, swiftly, and efficiently. And that is exactly what an incident response plan is who's supposed to be doing what, who's supposed to be saying what, which organizations and other partners are we engaging under which circumstances. It is the guidebook that tells you during your crisis what to do so you don't have to think about it. So over to you, Steve, for BCDR, and maybe a little bit of how that's connected to what I just described with the incident response plan and, of course, the DRAS.
Yeah, sure. So the incident response plan is tied into your BCDR plan because that team, you're going to need an incident response team in that plan. And each member of that team needs to have a defined role on what their job function is during this incident response plan. You're going to contact your backup provider. You're going to contact the FBI to let them know you've been attacked. We all need to make sure that this team has defined roles. And then the BCDR plan is going to use that team to engage that process depending on what your incident is. Your building could have gotten hit by a tornado. Obviously, you're not going to need the incident response team to contact the FBI for that, letting them know you've been hit by a security event. So a BCDR plan is very critical depending on the disaster that happens. There's several different types of disasters that we've discussed, and I would recommend that you create a run book filled with these different types of scenarios. And you're also going to need to test these scenarios. So You need to get a BCDR plan in place. What is critical to your company is probably one of the number one things that you need to document in this BCDR plan. What servers do you need to bring up? What stakeholders need access to the servers? What employees need access to the servers? Obviously, if your building got hit by a tornado, as an example, you're going to need a list of all the equipment that you have that you need to replace in your business continuity disaster recovery plan. And then you're going to need to have a contact list of everybody you need to contact based on what disaster occurs. Like I mentioned, your building got hit by a tornado. The first person you're going to probably want to contact is your backup provider. Say, help, my building is gone. Please bring up my site. We're going to go ahead and initiate our DR plan or our DRAS plan on the GDV side, and then we're going to start bringing your servers up. We would also suggest that in your plan, after you get your BCDR plan together, a runbook created, you need to work with your backup provider to test your DR as a service plan. Because when a disaster hits, you want to make sure that everything comes up and you have no gotchas. An example is you have a server that needed a public IP address that runs SharePoint services. You also need a public IP for your Exchange server. You need to update your MX records for your Exchange servers. Stuff like this, you need to document in both your BCDR plan as well as your DR plan, and then work with your provider to test your DR plan to make sure that there's no gotchas that you do not want to find out during an actual event.
Hey, Stephen, how many customers would you say that are victim or suffer some type of incident or disaster? How many of them would you say have a functioning BCDR or any kind of plan?
That is going to be a very low number. I'm not going to say that every single one of them have had a functioning BCDR plan or DRAS plan in place, or even a run book on what to do. You have to understand that whenever people call us, the Dataprise's BCDR team, they are in panic mode. Their building no longer exists. Their building caught on fire. They just got hit by ransomware. Everything is encrypted. They are losing millions of dollars a day in revenue. So normally whenever they call us, they do not have the BCDR plans in place, or a run book in place, or even an incident response team. So that is why I feel like that we mention this on every single webinar, because it's critical to your company that you need these in place.
We had another webinar or a series of things about how to create a BCDR plan. So we'll link it in the description. You can check that out. So we're going to hurry through this just a little bit to get to some more information in the interest of time. So BYOD, bring your own devices, mobility, right? The phones, the laptops, tablets, anything that connects to a network becomes a point of vulnerability or something that you need to have a plan for, right? Resilient infrastructure is that just limited to firewalls these days? Real quickly, you want to take us through that and the EDR?
Yeah, absolutely. So resilient infrastructure is no longer confined to just firewalls. There are lots of other resources that need to be factored in. Again, we're using, many of our clients are in hybrid infrastructures where part of their deployments are in the cloud, part of them are on premise, which means, when certain things fail, you need to ensure that your business, that your infrastructure is resilient enough to reroute traffic and to continue operation. Managed detection response, this is kind of AV on steroids, right? So this is more than just antivirus, anti-malware. This is really looking at behavior-based detections. So we're not as much reliant on definitions, right? Where this is the way things have always been done. We're now profiling processes and executables to determine what bad activities look like and what the precursors to those bad activities look like. And this is all happening in real time. So your modern endpoints like CrowdStrike or Microsoft's new Defender platform, Carbon Black, things like that. All of these are considered EDR or next-gen endpoint. And then Steve touched on this a little bit, which is tabletop testing of all of your things. I would say this is one of the biggest areas that companies tend to neglect is if you have an IR plan, you're not testing it. If you have BCDR plans, you're not testing them. If you have backups, are you testing them to ensure that they actually restore? Because all three of us have horrific stories where customers did not test them. They assumed that they were there. Crisis happens. And guess what? Backups don't work, or they weren't getting what they thought they were getting because they never tested them. And so if you're going to go through the process of creating any of these policies, processes, procedures, it is 100% incumbent on you to test them periodically.
Yeah, and to go along with that is vulnerability management. Third-party software that's on your computers. Every one of us probably has Adobe Reader or an internet browser like Chrome or something, some of the third-party software that needs to be patched because it does introduce vulnerabilities into the environment. And so often we forget about them because we only focus on what's put in front of our faces constantly, which is, Windows patches and this security thing from Microsoft, et cetera. We need to look at ways to isolate endpoints. So when we do have something detected, there is a breach or, some kind of risk that it's able to be isolated, right? And by isolated, we mean shut off from the rest of the environment so that it can't spread or cause any other issues. Continuous vulnerability assessments is just what it says. You need to constantly update and rethink and relook at how you're assessing your environment because there are people whose full-time jobs are figuring out new ways to hack and new ways to infiltrate networks and devices and get around MFA. And they're finding ways to do it faster and better every day, which is why it's important to have a SOC, 24/7, 365 monitoring to assist with detection and response of those things. When people are asleep, somebody's got to watch the gauges and the dials and all of that and help alert and notify people when things are seen. Obviously, automated backups with redundancy, that's where your whole BCDR and DRAS comes into play. Way back in the day, things used to have to be manual. You didn't have offsite, or your offsite was really cumbersome and you were relying on tape and certain other things. And today we have providers such as ourselves who can offer not only redundancy and cloud backups, offsite backups, et cetera, but we can provide an annual DRAS or DR test to ensure, like Jones mentioned, ensure that what you're doing is actually going to work. And, the security awareness training that Jones has already hit is something that we also do internally. It's always the most important. So just kind of combining everything that we've talked about so far is a good way to start on your vulnerability management process. So DRAS, real quick, Stephen, we talked about perimeters and you already mentioned enhanced data protection and a little bit of this, but can you just describe to us, that security perimeter when it comes to backups, how does that come into play? And how can we leverage enhanced data protection to protect customers better?
So you always want local backups with a good retention policy with failover capabilities to the cloud, the Dataprise BCDR environment. You want those backups to be air-gapped out of your repository so that you do not have access to them. Because if you have access to them, then the bad actors that get into your system will have access to them as well. So enhanced data protection is very important on the cloud side, but also you want to make sure that you have at least 3 copies of your data, which we'll discuss this a little bit later. But enhanced data protection, I cannot say that enough, because that is ultimately going to be your lifeline if you get a threat. You also want to make sure that you're testing your backups annually. The reason for this is an example that we had, or that I have, is we had a customer who did an annual test not too long ago and was going through the testing environment and realized that they forgot to include their entire Citrix system in the backups. So that is a big miss from a customer standpoint, not knowing that they didn't have backups of this environment. And that is why it's very important that you test your backups annually to make sure everything that you need in a DR situation is backed up locally and also backed up to the cloud. You do not want to find this out during an actual DR event.
Which takes us to our next point of what do you do when you're attacked? There's a couple of steps that people recommend. So cyber insurance, right, Jones? You got to call the cops basically and let them know what's going on.
Yeah, so your cyber insurance is usually going to be your first phone call during an attack. And the reason is your policy will probably dictate who your incident response can be provided by. So if you did not know that and you have cyber insurance, you may want to look that up because they may force you to use an approved provider that they dictate. And then, as Steve mentioned, contacting your backup provider should probably be your second phone call because you're going to want a plan for getting things reconstituted and getting your assets and your network back up and running. And of course, following your incident response plan. So after you've made those two critical phone calls, and your cyber insurance is not playing when they say they want to be your first phone call. If they find out they weren't, they can invalidate your policy or in general cause you lots of headache. Following your incident response plan, as we pointed out, hopefully you have one. Here's another pro tip that not too many people will mention. Print it out and put it in a 3-ring binder somewhere, because if you have a cyber incident, your building gets knocked down and it was on somebody's desktop, guess what? You no longer have it. So print it out, keep it in a couple of safe places as an actual tangible printed document, because you may be flipping through a 3-ring binder if your incident is severe enough. Containment, obviously, this is something that my team with our managed SOC service deals with quite a lot during an incident, is we want to contain the incident. So we use our EDR tools to isolate endpoints. So this temporarily disconnects them from the network, but leaves them running, which gives us forensic and incident response access to those devices, but limits them from being able to spread or contact any C2 servers or things like that. And of course, we're digging into the SIM and our SOAR. Our SOAR is automation and remediation platform. And this is basically an engine that we can build some remediation rules into to take automated action based on a set of inputs, right? So we can get an alert out of a SIM. We can take a pre-described set of actions on that alert. That is the job of the SOAR.
So the next steps, a lot of different things that we can do here, right? So the first thing would be an assessment. Assess your environment. Dataprise can help you with this. We have methodology in place to come in and assess the state of the union, if you will. Another function that we provide is a firewall audit. Again, kind of like I mentioned earlier, you've got stuff out there that you don't know necessarily is a hole or a backdoor or just maybe not a best practice for your firewall. We can come through and audit that for you. Get that penetration testing in there to make sure that everything is buttoned up tight. You know, if you live in the cold areas of the country, you might find that little crack underneath the door every so often that letting that cold air in. The same thing kind of goes for your firewalls. You need to have a way to validate or measure that. Continuing and ongoing end user security awareness training. Again, Joan said this should be probably one of your top priorities because we are the weakest link. Email phishing simulations. Part of our offering does provide this automated for you. We can work with you to send these out to your employees and basically test their ability to respond or recognize phishing emails and just continue to improve response and training that way. And then we get to the zip code. Stephen, can you tell us what 32110 is real quick?
Sure. That's 3 copies of your data on 2 different types of media, one off-site, one air-gapped copy with 0 errors, or what Veeam calls is their golden rule.
All right. There's a test on that at the end. So 3 copies, 2 different types of media, one off-site, one air-gapped, and 0 errors. Is that what you said?
That is what I said. You passed the test, Kelly.
Sweet. I get a cookie. So we've got some exercise links here that we'll provide to you for BCDR tabletop and security intrusion. Some good information there. In order to increase your basic cyber hygiene, these are really basic things. But again, these are not the minimums. You know, these are not 15 pieces of flair type things. This is where to start. Incorporate MFA, train those users, train and retrain the users. conduct regular security assessments to identify gaps. Again, things change. One gap, may be different from year to year. Ensure all your systems are up to date. Stephen and I talked at another webinar how important it is to keep your systems patched, make sure that those things are remediated, and then you're not leaving yourselves at risk. Monitor your network activity, because that's generally where you'll see a lot of nefarious things happening. Jones mentioned behavior and patterns, and these detection and response systems today can say, hey, this network traffic, this network pattern over here is unusual, and they can immediately isolate that. So just having those things in place. We do have a link here for a resource center that talks a little bit more about that. And apologize for rushing through this just a little bit, but I do know that we have a couple of questions, at least I hope we do, that we want to get to. So I will see if Trista is still awake over there.
This was amazing stuff. How dare you think that I would not be awake?
I know you would always be awake.
Yes, I love this stuff. I live for it. Okay, I do have a couple of quick questions. Anybody watching, feel free to put your questions into chat as well. You don't have to send them to me directly. How often should I revisit or make changes to my incident response plan?
I will field that one. I would say at a minimum annually. I would say a mature organization would build this in to their change management process so that large changes to the environment are kicking off an evaluation, review, or update of your incident response plan.
I was going to say there's two answers to that one, so I like it. Okay, the next question that I have, unless anybody else poses another one, I think this is in relation to the conversation we had about third-party vendors. There are many technology applications and platforms out there that my company can use. How can I help ensure these don't pose an additional security risk?
I can take that one as well. I can start the conversation there. So this is vendor risk assessments is basically the answer. If you're going to be using a third-party provider for some software, hardware, it doesn't matter. Your job here is to do a vendor risk assessment. It's basically to evaluate the security controls that the vendor has in place to ensure that they are following a modicum of security standards, and to understand, what links they go to prevent third abuse of their code base or compromise of their networks. So that is something you should do for every single vendor. If you're not doing that today, it's not too late. Something that Dataprise can certainly help you with is conducting those risk assessments for all of your vendors and providers.
And don't forget that vendor doesn't just stop at the software. It also covers people that could be on premises, that could be in your building, have access to computer systems. Maybe you create an account for people to do some work and then they leave and you never disable that account. Anybody that has access to any of your systems, employee, third-party vendor or not, must be monitored and controlled and maintained the same way. Because we often forget, oh, here comes Jones. He's been in and out of here every day for 6 months working on something. Suddenly Jones isn't there. Nobody says anything for a while except, oh, I guess Jones isn't coming around anymore, and IT never disabled his account. Jones can come in and do whatever he wants to without actually setting foot in the building.
Yep, we see that all the time. Really good addition, Kelly.
Awesome. Okay, so I just wanted to point out, I did post a number of links into chat. Feel free to grab those. Great today. I love the conversation that we had. If people want to hear more from Jones, I would highly encourage you to follow him on LinkedIn. He's got some great videos that he puts out there. And then also kind of where he lives on the Dataprise website. If you go to dataprise.com, cybersecurity-resource-center, there are some really valuable pieces of information there, and those 2 tabletop exercises and lots of stuff for you to consume. So I want to thank all of you. If you have any questions after the webinar is over, you can contact me at marketing@dataprise.com, and I can point you in the right direction to get you the right resource. And you can find any of our previous webinars and, of course, register to be notified of any future webinars at globaldatavault.com/webinars or at dataprise.com/resources-webinars, or just simply follow all of us on the socials at Global Data Vault and at Dataprise. So I want to thank you all again and have a great day.
Thank you.
See ya.